The Many Dialects of Rebellion, 1960 to 1975. New Patterns of Competition and Control in Africa, National Independence and the Weakening Bipolar System. A significant number of African nations gained independence in the 1960s. In his advocacy for the Congo's independence, Patrice Lumumba became the leading hero in Africa. He became active in the Pan-African movement seeking political independence, economic development, and access to education. Lumumba was abdicated and executed by a militarist who subsequently assumed control of the Congo. Pan-African movement. Pan-Africanism is the idea that peoples of African descent have common interests and should be united. In the aftermath of Lumumba's death, many aspiring nationalists in Africa and elsewhere came to believe that radicalism and militancy were the only viable strategies. South Africa. White minorities held tight to their rule over the majority through the use of violence and social segregation in parts of southern Africa. The nationalist movements in southern Africa became increasingly violent in the 1960s and 1970s. Nelson Mandela was a trained lawyer. Mandela became politically active with the African National Conference, which advocated political participation for the majority in South Africa. The South African Constitution underwent revisions in 1960, but when demands for the majority political participation were made, violence ensued. Mandela was arrested, charged with sabotage, and sentenced to life in prison. Black activism in the United States and the Pan-African movement. Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King, through marches and speeches, emphasized the individuals moving beyond racial distinctions and the need for laws to be colorblind. Some young black intellectuals and activists like Malcolm X criticized King for being unrealistic about racial reality in the United States. These activists viewed race as an important part of their identity and something to celebrate, and sometimes viewed violence as a means of change. Malcolm X, a man widely regarded as one of the most revolutionary and politically powerful black nationalist leaders of the 1960s. He was assassinated on February 21, 1965. Cassius Marcellus Clay, known to us as Muhammad Ali. In 1962, Ali announced his conversion to Islam in his new name, Muhammad Ali. While he never renounced his American citizenship, he did refuse to join the U.S. Army when drafted in 1967. Ali expressed his Pan-African identity through the turn to Islam, an act of civil disobedience and rejection of violence. Che Guevara and Transnational Revolution. Che Guevara was educated as a physician. She read philosophy, including Karl Marx and Jean-Paul Sartre. He also profoundly was influenced by the poverty and misery he saw during a motorcycle tour of Latin America in 1952. He was in Guatemala at the time of the overthrow of the Arbenz government and became convinced that democracy in itself was not enough to counter the collaboration of international corporations and the U.S. military. Che helped Fidel Castro overthrow the Batista regime in Cuba in the late 1950s and became a prominent member of the revolutionary government. He was instrumental in getting Castro to declare himself a communist and to create a socialist state in Cuba. She served in Africa and in Latin America in Cuba's international revolutionary campaigns. His last efforts were in Bolivia, where he failed to rally the peasants and was instead captured by American-trained Bolivian troops and killed. China, Mao Zedong. Mao started the Cultural Revolution in 1963, which lasted through 1976. Mao wanted a population that was both educated and fit for hard manual labor. Mao turned to students who were encouraged to identify people who were counter-revolutionaries, a process that increasingly led to violence. These gangs of students were eventually suppressed and condemned as counter-revolutionaries. The Cultural Revolution continued, however, and the economy degenerated because of the dispersal of professional elites. An enormous propaganda campaign spread a favorable image of the Cultural Revolution and produced a cult of Mao. North Korea. Kim Il-sung of North Korea began his political life as a resistance fighter against the Japanese. Once in power and supported by the Soviet Union, Kim claimed that South Korea was still occupied by the United States. Ho Chi Minh. In the 1950s and 1960s, Ho was still involved in a movement for national liberation, first against the French, then against the United States. He worked to rebuild society in North Vietnam so the largest possible workforce could be created together with the largest possible military force. Ho Chi Minh received help from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, and that was essential, but the basic contribution came from the Vietnamese people and their leaders. Reports of attacks on U.S. Navy vessels by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin led to the passage of a congressional resolution that gave President Lyndon Johnson virtually carte blanche to do what he thought necessary in Vietnam. Soon, hundreds of thousands of American troops were fighting in South Vietnam. Johnson's credibility was so badly damaged that he withdrew from the presidential race, leading to Richard Nixon's victory that fall. Nixon began a campaign of withdrawing American soldiers and turning the war over to the South Vietnamese, but at the same time he continued to pursue the war with bombing campaigns, extending them in 1969 to Cambodia and Laos. Colleges and universities in the United States shut down to protest the extension of the war. At Kent State University in Ohio, the National Guard, which was called out to maintain order on campus, fired into a crowd of demonstrators, killing 4. This led to an even larger demonstrations not only on college campuses but also in major cities around the United States. Nixon's Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. He talked about opening relations with the People's Republic of China, believing that China might be able to help end the Vietnam War. Nixon going to China would be an extraordinary event that might divert domestic attention away from the war and discomfort with the Soviet Union. In 1972, Nixon and Mao met in Beijing and agreed to the Shanghai Communique, which stated that there was only one China. End to Vietnam. Nixon's silent majority, those who had previously claimed as loyal supporters, was slowly disappearing. In other words, the conservatives. Little progress was made, in part because South Vietnamese president refused to cooperate. Agreement was finally reached late in 1972 concerning the end to the Vietnam War. An invasion of the South by the North followed the American troop withdrawal. Watergate. The Pentagon Papers from the New York Times revealed that Johnson and Nixon's administration had misled Congress and the public about the war. In the search for links, some of the White House operatives were arrested at the Watergate building. On August 9, 1974, Nixon resigned the presidency rather than face impeachment and probable conviction. Congressman Gerald T. Ford, who had replaced Vice President Spiro T. Agnew after his earlier resignation, became president. It was under President Ford that American forces evacuated Saigon in 1975 when the North Vietnamese reunited the country. Costs were very high for the Vietnamese, but also high for the United States, which had spent billions of dollars and lost 58,000 troops.